Hey, everybody. Welcome. I'm Vanessa Rose, the CEO of American Composers Forum. This is Uneven Measures, Artists Reflect in the 19th Amendment in 2020, which is a series we're doing with I Care If You Listen. Thank you so much for joining us for this panel. This panel and the whole series is supported by the Elizabeth and Michelle Sorrell Charitable Organization, Incorporated. And this panel is the third of the three panels we've had as part of this series called Advocating for Gender Equity. This will be recorded and made publicly available. Please feel free to use the hashtag Uneven Measures if you want to be doing any social media around this. And we will be sharing all three panels, as well as the mini essays, playlists, and various other things that we've been doing as part of this series as well. I'm going to turn it to our facilitator today, Aiden Feldkamp. Welcome, and thanks everybody for joining us.
Hey, thank you so much, Vanessa. Thank you to American Composers Forum. I'm Aiden Feldkamp, a writer and an inclusion specialist. I'm currently working at American Composers Orchestra as their Director of Emerging Composers and Diversity. So we have a panel of amazing artists today. I'm really excited. We're going to be digging into their work with all you today. And a reminder again, this panel is being recorded and you can watch it again after today on ACF's YouTube and on the Uneven Measures webpage. So just quick before we start, I'd like to talk a little bit about what is a definition of gender equity so that even if we're not on the same page, we're kind of in the same book. I really like the definition that Dr. Farah Jasmine Griffin gives. She's an author and a professor of English, comparative literature, and African American studies at Columbia. And she says, gender justice implies a politic where boys and girls, men and women, cisgender and transgender, gender nonconforming, and non-binary persons, everyone is valued equally, and they share in the equitable distribution of power, knowledge, and resources. So two things I take away from that. One, it's not just about cisgender women, it's about all gender minorities. And two, it's all about reallocating power, about creating equal opportunity to knowledge and to resources. So huge topic. We're not gonna get to it all today, it's just an hour. But I think we're gonna hopefully walk away with some tools that everyone can use to advance gender equity in their own spheres of influence. And we'll do that by looking at some of the projects of the amazing artists that we have here today. So I've said enough. I'm going to let each of the panelists introduce themselves and their practice. And Nirmala, let's start with you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me be part of this, and to the beautiful definition that you shared with us about what it means to have this discussion today. And yes, we are going to merely scratch the surface, but I'm very honored to be part of this very esteemed panel, moderated by you, Aiden. Thank you. To ACF and I Care If You Listen, thank you for having me on. Just a couple things about me: musician, composer, performer, educator, and a great believer in putting out the positive steps forward. As you can see, I'm a woman of color, and always felt very privileged to be in this position. I'm proud to be a woman of color. I'm proud to be coming from the roots that I come from. I have recently had the honor of serving as the co-chairperson of begun my term with the American Composers Forum of the Board of Directors. I serve as the vice president of the Global Carnatic Musicians Association, an organization that has formed very recently in 2019 for having a voice for South Indian classical musicians. I teach. I have a small little nonprofit called Nada Rasa, which we hope to build bridges through music. And I look forward to learning from all of you today in this discussion. Thank you.
Terry, let's hear from you next.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. Such an amazing panel and a great discussion. I'm still learning myself. I started an institute. Well, first of all, I'm a drummer and composer and producer. I've been playing drums in the jazz field and other fields, other genres too, but mostly in the jazz arena for over 40 years. And I started this institute at Berkeley College of Music called the Berkeley Institute of Jazz and Gender Justice, really to address this issue with the students and the faculty and this college in general, but also just to try to bring this conversation more to our culture. Jazz culture has been very involved, with the civil rights movement, and is known to be an activist culture, but I don't see the same activism when it comes to gender justice. So these are, interesting conversations that I'm having now with so many of my male peers. And because I didn't have a lot of women peers was why I'm doing this work now. So that's pretty much my story. Thank you.
It's awesome. Sarah, let's hear from you.
Oh, different order. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. And it's wonderful to be part of this important discussion with such amazing colleagues. I'm a pianist. I commission new music and work with many different composers. I started as a classical pianist, grew up playing Bach and Beethoven and hearing occasionally about a woman composer, but when I started focusing on new music, that's when I started working with Pauline Oliveras and Meredith Monk and Tanya Leon and many others, and doing recordings of Ruth Crawford. And that's actually a big part of why I focus on new music. It was important to me to raise my daughter with an image of a composer and a musician beyond what I was given when I was growing up. And I decided a few years ago to dedicate myself for a while to a project with about 60 works by women from the Baroque to the present day, partly as a personal discipline to do research and seek out these extraordinary composers from the past, and also to commission new work. And it's really opened up whole worlds to me. And I find that this kind of immersion is enormously gratifying and meaningful and important. I also have a weekly radio show on KALW in San Francisco, where I interview composers and musicians. And when there's not a global pandemic, I produce a big new music summer solstice concert at the Chapel of the Chimes in Oakland, lots of musicians performing simultaneously. I teach 20th century keyboard literature at San Francisco Conservatory and was a music critic for 20 years. But I would just say that with all of these aspects of my life, I try to think intentionally about issues of gender and race, and it's still very much a learning process, but I can say that everything gets better through conscious and intentional decision-making.
Awesome. And Neelafar.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, ACF and I Care If You Listen, and Aiden. It's really an honor to be among such really wonderful artists and also be talking about this really important discussion. So I'm a composer and a pianist. Also grew up playing mostly Bach and Beethoven and Chopin. And I decided to be a composer towards the end of college. It was something that I never imagined I would do because I just thought that I'm not good enough for it, or it's not for me. For this reason, for the kind of obstacles that I faced myself in finding myself as a composer, I thought of creating Iranian Female Composers Association so that the next generation after me would have some better chance and more confidence in themselves. It was also really important that, through Iranian Film Composers Association, I was also able to find my colleagues and my peers who have a similar journey as I did. And also we found out that there are so many of us out there, and together we're kind of a force that's just so much bigger than us individuals, and really does changes the stereotypes around gender, especially in Iran. So yeah, really excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so moving on, each of you has done really deep work in gender equity, and I want to talk about those projects a little bit. Terry, you founded the Berkeley Institute of Jazz and Gender Justice, like you were talking about before. The tagline for this program is Jazz Without Patriarchy, which I love. So we know that this program is extremely necessary. And I was wondering, what are you doing within your organization to cultivate a safe, creative space where people of all genders can thrive and learn?
Well, I think just starting the Institute and opening, the doors, so to say, it kind of created that space at the college. There were, I think, 3 transgender students that came right away. And I didn't know them. I didn't know they existed, at Berkeley. And they never reached out to me, before. So I think just kind of saying, here's a space for everybody. It's for everybody that's concerned with gender equity or gender justice. I try to use justice. I started off thinking of gender equity, and one of my friends and close friends and mentors, Dr. Angela Davis, who's on our advisory board, she told me, well, no, you have to use the word justice because you can have equality and equity without changing the conditions that created the inequity in the first place. And when you say justice, it's transformative. So as I said, I'm kind of learning as I go. But what's really interesting to me is a lot of the young men that come to study within our institute are, I think, tired, have grown fatigued of having to perform masculinity because I do feel like, there's been a certain sound and a certain culture that's been in jazz for so long that some people, even young men that are aspiring jazz artists, feel that they have to fit into this culture and in essence perform masculinity or jazz masculinity, as Nicole Rustin has penned it. You mentioned Farah Jasmine Griffin, and she's also on our advisory board. She's amazing. And so if there are young men that are worried about having to perform this masculinity, imagine, what the young women or other, people on the gender spectrum feel. So I realized one day, because it didn't really happen to me, so to say, I feel like I was the type of person that just fit in to this community. I didn't really have to change much about myself, but I kind of woke up one day and realized, oh, everybody's not the same. And some people, are very uncomfortable, and they if they get hit on, they change, something about their personality, or become tougher, or these various dances that happen just because they love this music and want to play it. And I talked to some students, and when they explained parts of their journey to me, I really felt obligated to at least start at the institute that I teach at to try to bring this subject up, make some change, also with admissions, other departments, to make sure that they're also conscious of it, because so many people just say that they didn't know, they didn't realize it. And I always quote Ella Baker. She had said, Ella, Titan in the civil rights movement, and she had said that at a speech I heard that basically no one in this room has a campaign of racism per se, but everyone in this room basically has participated or benefited from a racist culture. And when I thought about that, I thought about the same thing with sexism and misogyny. And so that's kind of where I come from, is in my thinking, myself included, because I wasn't paying attention. How have I benefited from this, or how have I been a part of the problem and not the solution? So just opening the doors. I remember one person came to our opening day, and I had asked her to come to sing something, and she just walked in, and when she saw the sign, Jazz Without Patriarchy, she just started crying. And this is somebody I would never have expected that from. And she said, you know, just the very existence of creating this space really is taking a burden and a weight off of me. So, yeah, as I said, I'm still evolving myself, but I do know that once you see something, you can't unsee it. And once you open this Pandora's box of activism, you can't really undo it because it's all connected. So I can't talk about gender justice without thinking and feeling and, you know, having a personal relationship with racial justice as well, or environmental justice. And so the intersection of all these things has really come to the surface right now. And I'm just trying to, you know, make a difference with my students and my colleagues however I can.
Cool. Would anyone else like to add to that about organizationally creating safe spaces or welcoming spaces for people of all genders? Nope. Okay, we'll move on. I definitely feel what you're saying about just like creating the space and having it there is like such a huge step. Because I think so many of us feel like we don't know where to go or that we're not welcome in like the status quo space.
Yeah, and also, you know, it takes effort. I think we've all been a bit in our silos, you know, learning. It's hard enough to learn how to play an instrument or to compose. All of that is difficult.
Yeah.
So we spend a lot of time doing that and not necessarily spending the extra effort that it takes to be truly inclusive. And, you know, even, you know, with people that are of an older generation, sometimes having struggles with pronouns. You know, I always say, well, you know, if your daughter gets married and changes her last name, it doesn't take you that long, right, to adjust. So it's just thinking along those lines. And, you know, sometimes it's what I found is there's some genuinely good people that just haven't thought enough about it. And so once I, you know, start talking about patriarchy being kind of the root, you know, foundation of patriarchy and white supremacy, kind of being a part of the root problem of, you know, racism and sexism, and make that connection, I think, you know, people start to think differently about it. So we actually changed our mission statement. It had gender justice in it, and I changed it to racial justice and gender justice.
Yeah, I feel the two are inextricably intertwined. Okay, so staying a bit in the education space, Nilüfer, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about the Iranian Female Composers Association that you've started and you still run. So not only are you promoting the music of Iranian composers in the United States and abroad, but you're also teaching young women in Iran, correct?
Yeah, well, actually more as a being a teaching institution, more as an ally, and where we are just there for each other, not necessarily doing like regular workshops and so on. But we do provide concerts and curate concerts 2 times or 3 times a year, and also other ensembles approach us and are interested to work with us. And in that way, we can promote the work of Iranian female composers that are our members. But you know, stemming from that, actually, one of the IFCA composers started a workshop. It's called MMC Workshop, and it's directly working with Iranian composers in Iran who are more in the younger generation, more between like 15 to 25 years old, and that has been really inspiring, and IFCA has definitely been a huge supporter of that, and we are kind of an ally in that program as well, and excited to see it grow. And we've been discovering some younger members through that workshop as well.
That's so cool. So in terms of logistics, when you're connecting composers and performing ensembles, how are you bridging that gap? What are you doing as an organization to bring those two like pieces together?
Definitely. So I think the first step is that we are a collective, and what that means is that the people that I know, ensembles that I know, or performers that I know, and trying to understand me, and then they also get to know IFCA, and they're like, oh, well, what are some other composers in IFCA that we can work with? And then so like that's just people that I can bring into IFCA, and then there's me multiplied by 40. There's like 40 other composers that we have, and so all those people that they work with will then get a chance to not only work with composers that they know, but actually a chance to meet other composers. And so that's just the first step, as like how a collective can really be a force in expanding network like that. And I think it's really, really important that as an administrator or someone who wants to promote for equity, that you build a relationship with the composers that you want to work with. And my colleagues, both Anita and Ida and I, the three of us are really committed to this, and that, we don't just have a list. And it's something that we actually had to learn. We didn't know that, but we realized that it's just really important that we know that the people that we're advocating, we're following them on Instagram, we're talking on the phone, and we're connecting on a deeper level than just whenever there's a concert, send me your score. Right, the connection has to be so much more. And I think I do see sometimes that some organizations trying to advocate for composers are just coming up with lists, and it's not enough really to just do that. And it's really important to have a relationship. And once you do that, you're aware of what they're working on, what their future plans is. So like, any opportunity that comes around, the three of us knowing these composers would be like, oh, this person has that. Like, let me like call her now. Or like, oh, this person's working on this. I think she would be able to use this opportunity in this way. And so, but like, if we didn't have that relationship, then we wouldn't know those things, certainly. And also, I think just generally, for like mid-career and like rising stars, emerging stars who are like getting, noticed and getting a lot of opportunities coming their way, I think if they are going to say no to some of those opportunities, I think it would be nice for all of us to kind of practice this idea of, okay, if I'm going to say no to this, maybe I can think of someone that I think can really, really benefit from this opportunity in a really important way, and actually use that as a way to have a composer have this opportunity that otherwise they wouldn't have. And so I think that's just a general good practice for artists to do in general, if they're like at a level where they are saying no to a bunch of stuff, to put the time in and pass it on to someone that can really benefit from it.
Awesome. Do any of the other panelists have anything they'd like to add to this particular topic? Okay, cool. This is actually a really good segue, talking about community and the kind of power of having a collective. I'm going to move a little bit to the performer side of it. So Nirmala, you bring your Carnatic practice into collaborative spaces alongside Western classical music, jazz, a bunch of other types of music. So how does community play into your artistic and professional practice, and how does that drive your collaboration?
Thank you, Aiden, for that question, and to Terry and Nilofer for their very, very valuable thoughts. In fact, I was resonating with both of you. I just didn't want to talk about it at this point because it was just profound what you both said. And community, it takes a village to raise an artist. We all know this. And this is the truth of community. And without the community, I certainly wouldn't be where I am. Whether it was the community where I was raised in, which is the Carnatic music circles, my own parents, my families. When you're just a young person, your teachers, they form your community, they form your audience when you begin. Then slowly, there's a bunch of people that really think that maybe they should support you. And this is not people you know, but people you don't know, which you've been blessed to receive that support. Then as you start growing as a performer and start also taking on mantles of writing music, which in Carnatic music is a very, very common thing to improvise. You don't even think of it as composition, though now I realize that all of that is composition of a different kind, improvisation or improvisation as it's called here. So that is the first thing that comes to mind. When I moved to England, so community is by interest, I would like to say, by place, which is geography, by practice, and of course, action. And this is something that has revealed itself to me in my 4-decade journey. And when Terry was talking about the opportunities to perform, but being a percussion artist, how she feels about that and what she has encountered, I was so relating to that, because one of the first things I realized, I went to England and I was asked to do a recording for the BBC, and the mridangam, which is the traditional South Indian instrument, that artist was not available on the day of the recording. So they asked me to work with a North Indian artist who plays tabla. Now, even though they're both Indian music systems, Carnatic and Hindustani, they are quite different in many ways. And it takes a good amount of study to have collaborations happen. And the very first thing I learned was that I had to learn the language of the tablas. And I was lucky that the gentleman who was going to play with me, I was very young at that time. He was a much older, much more experienced person who gave me a 2-day workshop on how to work with a tabla artist. And that began my first collaborative journey with Hindustani music. And then having lived in Europe, I was incredibly interested in learning about the other forms that I saw around me. And that started off a curiosity journey, as one might say. And I was teaching all along. So here I am being a student all the time, learning about other forms. At the same time, teaching Carnatic music to interested people. And I was learning that as I was doing both these functions, that it was very interesting, this voyage of discovery of handshakes. I call my collaboration handshakes because in my lifetime, I could not learn Carnatic music properly. This is a 2,000-year-old art form. I cannot even imagine trying to learn anything about jazz or Persian music. I lived in Iran for a few years, so I was aware of some of the beauties of the maqams or Western classical music or Chinese music or any of the collaborations I've done in my life. I know that I'm not going to be lucky enough to learn all this lifetime, but I certainly realized that I can try and do a handshake, and thankfully we connect at some level because of music. It's the language of emotion. My instrument is Carnatic music, of course, the Saraswati Veena and the voice, but the language of expression is the same for all of us. We use different tools to connect. So I found that this community that was first Carnatic, my own family, grew to something else, then became something else in different countries that I lived. So the audiences, students, my collaborators, and now even this forum is a community that we're all learning to work with. And I also feel the incredible power of being part of a community that makes one feel much greater than oneself because we're part of something much bigger than us. We may be a small little atom in this community, but we feel like the power of unity, of wanting to do something together. And equity and gender equity, racial equity, as Terry was saying, it all connects at some level. This past year, I think this was in March, I was commissioned to write a work by University of Wisconsin River Falls. And last year and a half, climate change has been very much in my mind. There was an 18th century composer from India who wrote about the 5 elements. You know what they are, so I'm not naming that. But that has been on my mind, and I've been doing workshops for my students and others who've asked me about taking care of the environment. So when this opportunity came to write for many groups in the University of Wisconsin River Falls system, I wrote this piece called Elements, Respect, and Responsibility. And I'm looking back at it, and I'm thinking to myself how much I have come from being a Carnatic musician in South India, in Chennai, playing the veena. Life's experiences have given me the opportunity to bring this music to so many different places, as you say, community. My own school, I have to say this before I finish up here, I was resonating with Terry once more when she talked about this young lady who came to sing and, burst into tears when she saw the name of that. it's so interesting. The number of performers you see on the circuit, there are many women performers on the Carnatic music circuit. And typically, there's the lead, and then there is the accompanying ensemble. The leads, there are many women, but if you find all the groups that get together and have conversations, I find more male artists doing that type of thing. The women are not part of those, those groups having those discussions. Whereas when I teach in my school, the great number of learners identify themselves as girls. And I have very few young men, particularly as they go up in their lesson modules and reach levels of performers, I find there's a decline in the young boys that come to sing. So I have taken it upon myself to make sure that we try and recruit as many young voices of boys who would like to come and sing with us or with any other people from the gender spectrum. And I'm making it a very conscious effort on my part because it is very interesting to find all these men at the performing level. Somewhat, the ratio is not very equal because you see the leads may be women, but I don't find as many percussionists, women accompanying artists in the percussion world of Carnatic music. We can count them on the fingers of one hand. Whereas the drummers are all mostly those that identify as men, but definitely not as women. So what I'm trying to see here is how is this interesting phenomenon? When they come to learn, I see lots of young girls in the classes, but when they go out into the world to perform, the percussionists, of course, go study percussion separately, but I would like to see more young men coming to learn from a woman teacher as well. So that I find is an encouraging sign in my school that I find this growth in the ranks from young boys to young men now. Several of them are taking this mantle on and going forward. In my own organization, Nada Rasa, which we just began last year, and the idea is to build bridges through music, but I'd like to also emphasize that we also believe in very strongly in anti-racist activities and gender equity activities, not because I have taken a beating in this, but I do sense the reluctance. People seem to think women are pushovers sometimes, and they can get their way done. And sometimes I don't think that's okay to let this feeling foster and carry on. And it's, I think, our job, and it's a very important duty to break this perception and to make sure that there's equity across the board, irrespective of what you identify as. It should not be the way that it is. And I also see among my younger counterparts in music, men and others, that there is a lot of difference in the attitude and thinking. I'm seeing a very conscious change happening, and that I feel augurs well for the future. And I'm constantly, saying this again and again, even if at the cost of sounding boring and irritating, that there has to be equity in every place that I am involved in some way or the other. I make sure that that part has come from me, and I slowly keep working at it. If it doesn't happen today, I believe it will happen tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. So I have great faith in that power of attrition. Keep at it and keep going and keep building on whatever you have done. And ultimately, that is going to happen because that's the only fair way to look at life. There is no other fairness. There is only one fairness. It's either right or not okay. So, that's really clear. Thank you for this opportunity.
Of course. That's fantastic. Does anyone else want to add on that specific topic before we move forward? Okay, cool. So Sarah, I'm turning to you now. Pianist, your recent project that you were talking about, The Future is Female, focusing on promoting the works of women composers. So in terms of programming, in terms of being a musician and living in this industry, what is gender equity in music? What will that look like to you? Oh, you're still muted.
Hi. I was saying I love the term gender justice, and Angela Davis is that's just wonderful to hear about. And this is such an inspiring discussion and makes me think about mentorship and how you, Terry, and Nirmala and Nilufar you've already made such a powerful impact on young musicians and changed their lives. And It's really, really inspiring. In terms of being a musician, I think it's important to not just see this issue in terms of contemporary music, but also looking to the past, that there's no reason why touring pianists at major concert halls shouldn't include Baroque suites by Elizabeth Jacquet de la Guerre or romantic work by Fanny Mendelssohn. And it would make such a huge impact if every classical musician would just commit to one work by a non-male composer. And it's just astonishing to see new seasons announced now with orchestras and chamber groups, or like the next season, that they're exclusively male composers. And you think, well, what planet are you on, really? I listened to the panel on intersectionality last Friday, which was wonderful and illuminating. And what Terry is talking about, that everything is interrelated, makes so much sense. And there are certainly overlapping issues here. So it's not enough to perform music by women, but we have to perform music by women of color and music by all genders. So conductors are very happy to include one work by Carolyn Shaw or Kaya Sariaho or Missy Mazzoli and think their work is done. But then you run into the same blind spot that hindered the first and second wave of the feminist movement or the women's suffrage movement, where white women are recognized, but women of color are often left out and marginalized. And so now that we've had this accepted canon of white male composers for centuries, I think, are we in danger of another accepted canon of white women composers? And we have to really work against that, do our research, and reach out to composers of color of all genders. And I thought that Elizabeth A. Baker articulated this really eloquently when she wrote on New Music Box an article called "Ain't I a Woman Too?", echoing the title of the speech by Sojourner Truth. She says, the subconscious presentation of diversity framed exclusively as a middle-class white cisgender woman's problem has the ripple effect of silencing women of varied ethnic backgrounds and gender identities. And she advocates so beautifully for real inclusivity and diversity. In working with students at the, I'm reading a little bit here. In working with students at the San Francisco Conservatory and also around the country, it's sometimes discouraging to hear the same closed-mindedness that I grew up with, the same sense of, I just want to play real music, that somehow music by women is in a different category. And so it's really fascinating to me when I work with students to work on breaking down that implicit bias and ask the students about those preconceptions, because those biases are passed down from their teachers and from the teachers' teachers and so on, from generation to generation. And when they actually listen, when you play works by Margaret Bonds and Florence Price or Unsuk Chin's Etudes or Gabriela Ortiz Preludes and Etudes, they get very excited and they want to learn those pieces. So the music does speak for itself, but it needs to be introduced to students. And of course, there has already been tremendous headway, like Nirmala is saying. So the young ensemble contemporaneous can perform a whole concert or even a whole season of music by non-male composers, but they don't even announce it. They just say, here's this music that we're performing that's worth your attention. And I think, that's the ultimate goal, that you just say, you don't have to say this or this. I've always been ambivalent about all women composer concerts, even though I'm doing it myself now. So when when I go hear a pianist lump together Amy Beach and Fanny Mendelssohn and Ruth Crawford just because of their gender, it sort of made me suspicious of this way of thinking. There's music, and then there's music by women composers, because we can't get to gender equity if we have this binary system of two separate camps. Or if orchestras do like women composers concert and then now music, right, for the rest of the season. So, but one of the most important and powerful advocates here in the Bay Area was the Women's Philharmonic. It was called the Bay Area Women's Philharmonic, which gave fantastic performances of work that is so worthy but unheard, everyone from the 1600s onwards. And you never felt like, oh, but it's all women. You never felt it limiting in any way. They still maintain a website and repertoire list, and they've created great working editions of early music. It's just a really marvelous organization. So I think when advocacy and education are involved, it's okay to say this is music you really should know about. I also object to the way that we describe women composers, especially in the past, always in terms of their lives in a way that can belittle them. So like poor Clara Schumann, she had 10 children and a mentally ill husband, or poor Florence Price, who had such a hard time getting her work performed. And I think sometimes that can be an obstacle to, that pity can be an obstacle to really listening to the music on its own. And speaking of Florence Price, I think of those very powerful letters that she wrote to Serge Koussevitzky, where she says, I know you'll think less of my scores because I'm an African-American woman, but just look at them, just experience my music on its own terms. And again, with students I teach, once they listen to the music and get past their preconceptions and their prejudice, they recognize its excellence. But it just takes really listening. And on the other hand, I think it's so important to hear these stories. I worked recently with a 19-year-old composer, Michelle Lee, who is at Oberlin, who talked about being one of the few women, the only woman of color, at Tanglewood and other music festivals, and that those situations, which are supposed to be nurturing, supposed to be a safe haven where you learn and you grow and you thrive, it can actually be a toxic place for young women. And so it does help to hear about Kaya Sariaho in the same sort of toxic environment when she was at IRCAM with Pierre Boulez and his circle, or when Pauline Oliveros used to talk about being on the faculty at UC San Diego, and she'd go to faculty parties where all the men would bring their wives, but she felt that she couldn't bring her partner. So these stories, I think, are really important. And in the first of these uneven measures panels, Gabriella Frank talked about the strength required by women composers, the determination needed to persevere. And I think about composers like Mary Watkins here in Oakland. I recently commissioned a new solo piece from her. She's 81 and a remarkable voice in music, but as an African-American woman, she hasn't gotten anywhere near the recognition she deserves. And, you know, but she's very strong. And I just really appreciated hearing that from Gabriella Frank about the perseverance that is necessary. So I've just expressed some conflicting thoughts about the topic, but I do think some headway is being made here in San Francisco, where we've bemoaned the symphony season for years. The current season looks far better than usual in terms of gender equity. And so I think we are making headway.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. It's so funny you bring up programming, and like, we're so used to seeing seasons that are just, you know, all Beethoven, all Mozart, all a bunch of dead white guys that like, we don't, you know, we've been trained to like see it a certain way. And I remember the first time, like something that I love to do to kind of like remind myself of how abnormal that is to take, in the office, we would get like the season brochure, you know, LA Phil or something. And I would go through and highlight every work that was written by a woman and every work that was written by a person of color. And you flip through and see how few works are highlighted. And you're like, well, it should be way more than this, right? And it's just not. So I think it's a question of like re-evaluating. Again, it's unconscious bias. We don't know it's there. That's why it's unconscious. really thinking, oh, what am I thinking of when I'm thinking of a composer? What am I thinking of when I'm thinking of a season? Like, who is a composer? What is played by an orchestra? And how can we start to completely dismantle those ideas?
Yeah, and yeah, for instance, Germaine Taillefer's Ballade. You listen to it and you say, wow, that sort of sounds like she's ripping off Ravel's G major piano concerto. And then you look at the dates, and Taillefer's Ballade was written in 1920. Ravel's concerto was written in 1930. So 10 years later. So it's one of those things where you really have to do your homework, and you have to see that, you know, who is ripping off who. You know, not that he ripped off her, but really.
I mean, we've taken the time to study, you know, the classics, the canon. We should take just as much time to study all these other pieces that weren't included in our education. You know, if we went to music school, and that was like, we got the average education, which leaves so much out. Something that everyone kind of brought up that I'd love to get back to is this idea of mentorship, and like, how does mentorship play a role in advocating for gender minorities, composers, performers, whoever you have an influence over? So I'd love to hear you guys talk a little bit about mentorship and what part that plays.
If I may, it was very inspiring to hear you, Sarah. Thank you. And I'm actually thinking about something you said in response to what Aiden has just said, which is the biases, the inherent biases, the intrinsic biases that have been handed over generation through generation, and that we are perpetuating. I'm talking about myself here, without even realizing those biases are there. So the very important thing that mentorship helps is, once I have identified my biases and have realized that this is happening, and this is something that I have to talk about in the opportunity that I have with my students, with the communities I serve, very clearly, to get them eliminated. So it's a very simplistic thing, but it's a very important educating factor about biases, about this important aspect that we need to shed light on, and to show at what levels it's happening, and how it's just built into the system, in every system that we talked about, all our practices, all our organizations, it's there. So if I may say that, that's a very powerful thing to be able to mentor. It's also a huge responsibility. And personally, I think it's a duty. I take it like that, as a great opportunity to put it out there. We have very intelligent people consuming this from us. They can definitely see what is in front of them if we present it correctly, and show them what we've experienced and what we would hope they don't have to experience. I think, Sarah, when you introduced, you also talked about your daughter not having to see the same kind of thing that you saw. And that was something I didn't think about, but I think I did that without even thinking about that for my two young children that I have. They're grown-ups now. But I think I was thinking that all along, that they would have to see it the way it should be seen, and probably modeling it without realizing it, that we have to be strong. We have the strength. We have the same brain as everybody else. We have the same everything made up. So when we model, when we mentor, this comes through in action. And of course, that action is very important, that we practice what we say. And I'm still trying, I'm learning, and I've learned already a lot today to examine my biases about these matters, and be more vocal about it and practice it strongly. So I will rest my case here just to say that those biases need to be called out and need to be acted upon. As a mentor, I think that's very important for me to do that. Thank you.
Yes, ditto. I think that I agree 100% with everything that you just said, and everything everybody has said. I think we're all on the same page of understanding this journey that our society is going through. And the only way that we'll have a better society is if we pass on what we know and what we've learned. And I agree, we have to look at ourselves and look at how we either have, grown, and we can explain to other people our own growth. And I think that makes it easier for them to see sometimes. And realizing that at least, most art forms are apprentice art forms. They don't really function well without passing down knowledge. And so it really amazes me when I see artists that aren't doing that, that aren't passing down, information. And when we're younger, I think we're, as I said before, just busy trying to get it together. But it reaches a point that you have to, see what your purpose is, be committed, because whatever art form it is, it will not reach its full potential until these kinds of things are addressed. So I don't understand if somebody loves an art form that they're dedicated, they've sacrificed for, that means you love it to some degree. And how could you love something and not want to see it reach its full potential? And when you leave groups out, then it's not going to reach its full potential. You don't even know what that potential is. So that's, something I've been thinking a lot about lately. And we have to be able to criticize the thing that we love the most.
Yeah, I think being critical is important. As long, constructive criticism is what makes something grow. I found for myself that mentorship has been crucial, that people who are in power, that they're like handing down opportunities or knowledge or training of some sort, has been absolutely crucial. And I think that I've seen that elsewhere in this field. Like you say, it's an apprenticeship in a lot of ways. And, how can we find ways to be a mentor? And, I think you have all four are very good examples of being mentor and handing down that knowledge and that experience. I kind of want to come back around to this idea of like, if you could look into the future and we have an equitable practice, an equitable industry, what does that like look like? Whether that's logistical or whether that's like a more like feeling spiritual thing, like what are you imagining for the future?
Can I answer that? Well, I don't know if I have an answer for that completely, but I can add a perspective. That for me, creation and just art making in general, I really, really believe in that. That's why I dedicated my life to it, because I believe it has meaning, it has importance, especially has importance in shaping our future. Because it does affect our society right now, and that's why it has an effect on our future. And so I think for that reason, I think especially it's important that everyone has an access in shaping that future. Everyone needs to be part of storytelling of what can be in the future, and that's why it's really important also that that we make sure that all kinds of people, all kinds of backgrounds, and all kinds of experiences are able to be part of this and shape that future, I think.
Anybody else? I know, like, I logistically am always thinking kind of like that, we'll go to a concert and the orchestra, it'll be totally normal for them to play a program that's just like, a huge mix of style, of gender, of race. And like, these things are not like qualified by that. They just are music and they fit together and they're creating something together that's just beautiful. And it's not, just one voice, or just one demographic having representation. And not only in the programming, but like on the stage and on the conductor stand and behind the scenes in the admin offices. Like, that for me is what I think about. But I always love to hear what others have to say. Do we have any closing remarks before I pass it back to Vanessa to wrap up?
I guess one question I have is, when you're talking about this concert in the future and this kind of utopian vision of the concert hall, which is so great. I assume that composers ultimately want to be called composers and not women composers or trans composers or to have labels attached. But do you think that's true? I mean, when we label composers, when we label all composers except for white male composers, when we say here's an African American composer, here's a Iranian composer, I mean, I'm wondering if that's a good thing or a bad thing. If the ultimate goal is just to have everyone be labelless, or if labels are a good thing.
That's a great question. I think individually people will answer this differently because, I mean, labels are a funny thing because they can be very divisive, but they can also be creating community and creating identity. So like, you know, wherever I go, I'll say I'm a trans writer. Like I won't like not talk about that because it's a huge part of what I write about in my personal experience. But it's not like I want to be hired like because I'm trans and like no other reason. So I'm pretty sure that as women, like like that makes sense. But, you know, I think that giving people the space to be identified as they wish to be identified to the extent or the limit of that, if they just want to be a composer, or if they really want to be known as like, I'm a woman composer from America, like this is my heritage or whatever, like that's their prerogative and that's what's important and that's what's coming through in their artistry. But I don't know, I think everyone could have a different answer to that.
If I may add on and also respond to your thing, Aiden and Sarah, I would love to see that concert if I walked into that concert personally.